Okay, this is going to be a quick video on some Excel basics. So I have a pretty simple spreadsheet here. It's got 38 rows. It's got a couple columns that are categories, text data, and then it's got a bunch of numerical columns. And this is wiretapping data. So the first thing that we might want to do is just say add up one of these columns. So to do that, we're going to insert a formula into one of these cells. So each of these boxes is a cell. And to insert a formula, I'm just going to come up here to the formula bar, type equals. That's important. It always has to start with equals, a formula does. And then I'm going to type sum. Sum is the command for adding up. And then I'm going to come here and I'm going to select everything that I want to add up. So I'm just going to click and drag. And then I'm going to close my parentheses and hit enter. And I now have the total of this column. Another way to do the same thing is to come here, I'll type equals sum, and then I'm going to tell it the range of cells that I want to sum up instead of clicking and dragging. So this is cell D4 and this is cell D38. So I'm going to say D4 colon D38, the colon means through, and that will sum that column. Once I have this formula, I can drag it across, and it will take that formula and change it for each of these columns, so it's now adding up these columns. So we have total cost here for each intercept, and so this is the total cost of all intercepts, and maybe I want to know the percent of the total money spent that's represented, say, by this intercept. So I can say here this column is going to be percent of total, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to insert a formula, and if I want to know the percent, it's just going to be part divided by whole. So it's the part, and then it's going to be divided by this cell here. And I'm going to put a $sign right here to tell it that we don't want to move that one. We want to keep that one always the same. And then I can pull this down. Okay, quick error there. So what I had before was $sign H40, so pointing at this cell. But what I want to do is $H $sign 40, and that locks it so that when we move down, we're always referencing this cell. So now I have a couple options. I can get my black plus sign, drag this all the way down, and get my percentages. I'm going to Apple Z. I can also select all of these, come here and fill down. So those are two options for doing that. Okay, so that is how to create new columns. This is also how you would create ratios and rates and do some simple calculations. But I want to look at pivot tables now because pivot tables will let us do some of the same things. So I'm just going to get rid of what I've done. All right, so a pivot table is a really common technique used in data analysis, and the pattern that we're talking about is group the data in some way and then perform some calculation on the group. So I'm going to show you what I mean. If I'm in my data, I come here to data, summarize with pivot table. It should by default select your whole table, which is what we want, and I'm going to hit OK. This is the interface for a pivot table, and pivot tables use rows and values, and it's a little confusing, but I will walk through and it makes sense once you start doing it. So the rows are going to be what I'm going to group by. So we had the offense column, and this was a text column, and it was basically a category column. So I'm going to drag that into rows, and you'll see these. It's now gathered all the different offenses that are in my table. Now, a really basic thing that I might want to do is just know how many rows in my table are assault, how many are conspiracy, how many are murder. And if I want to do that, I can just drag any of these over to values and do count. So count's just showing me how many rows. So I had 35 total rows in my table, and now I know that most of them were narcotics. So that's a very simple thing to do, but I might want to get rid of these, you just drag them up here. It's kind of confusing. A more common thing might be, I want to know which of these kinds of offenses cost more to wiretap. So I have my total cost, and if I drag it here, it's going to default to the sum of total cost. Make this bigger for you. So it's going to default to the sum of total cost. And that's not going to tell us what we want, because we knew that some of these have a lot of rows and some of these have very little rows. So if I click on the little I right here, I can change sum to average. And I now know the average cost of surveilling for each of these different offenses. And if I click the arrow right here, it's going to bring up my sorting options. And I can say that I want to sort by the average of total cost, and I want to do descending. And so now I know that wiretap for a murder case costs more than for a conspiracy case, possession, narcotics, and assault. So that is the basics of pivot tables. I can add any number of these that I want. So I might want to know the average number of intercepts, and I'll do the same thing. And I can add all sorts of things here. One downside to pivot tables in Excel is that they don't let you do medians, which is a little strange. But it's okay. This is still a really useful way. You can also group by multiple things if you want to. It doesn't really make sense here, but we could say let's group by first the offense and then the jurisdiction. And it's going to calculate our entire table for everything, or we could switch it to jurisdiction followed by offense. So that's an option. So before we quit this video, I want to show you one more thing. So what we had done earlier was we had totaled some columns, right? So say the total cost, and I wanted to know the total cost of all the wiretaps. And the way we had done that is we had added a formula right here. And I actually don't love doing that because I want to keep my table just as my rows of data. So a way that I like to do that better is using pivot tables. And if I just come here to total cost and bring it down to value, I can get the sum of the total cost right here. And that way I know things and I haven't messed up my data. So for simple calculations like that, pivot tables can also be a really useful thing. And I could even add multiple pivot tables here. So this sheet could be, say, my sums, and then I could add another one if I wanted to do average cost per offense or something like that.